The year is 1956. A young man in Memphis walks onto a stage, guitar in hand, hips moving in a way the world has never seen before. His name? Elvis Presley. His voice? A fusion of gospel soul, blues grit, and rock and roll fire. That night, Elvis didn't just sing a song, he rewrote the rules of music. Across the ocean, in a small colonial town thousands of miles away, a boy named Farrokh Bulsara was just beginning his journey. That boy would one day become Freddie Mercury. The connection between these two men may seem invisible, but in reality, it was a thread woven through melody, rebellion, and raw emotion. Elvis was more than an artist. He was a cultural earthquake. He shattered boundaries in the 1950s and 60s, bringing a new sound, a new style, and a new spirit of freedom. He embodied the idea that music could challenge authority, transcend race, and unite people who had never stood together before. For a world still confined by tradition, Elvis was a lightning bolt of possibility. And in the 1970s, another star began to rise. Freddie Mercury, the flamboyant frontman of Queen, emerged with a voice unlike any other, 4 octaves of pure electricity. Yet, behind the glitter, behind the theatrics, lay the influence of the king himself. Elvis's voice had reached Freddie long before the world knew his name. Elvis had taught him what music could be: dangerous, thrilling, liberating. What's remarkable is this: Elvis and Freddie never met. They never shared a stage, never shook hands. Yet, when you peel back the layers of Mercury's artistry, you hear the echo of Elvis in every note. From the swagger on stage to the emotional punch of a ballad, Freddie carried with him the blueprint of rebellion and the courage to live without apology. Freddie himself admitted it. He once said, "Elvis is the one who started it all." And years later, when the world lost Elvis in 1977, it was Freddie who turned grief into creation. With Crazy Little Thing Called Love, he paid homage to the king, proving that legends don't die. They live on in those they inspire. This is not just a story about two musicians. It's about how influence travels like electricity across time and space. It's about a boy who found courage in another man's voice. And it's about how the spirit of Elvis Presley didn't end in Memphis. It exploded into arenas filled with Queen's anthems, amplified by Freddie Mercury's fire. So tonight, we'll unravel the invisible thread. From Elvis's groundbreaking revolution to Freddie's meteoric rise, from rebellion to tribute, from legacy to immortality. This is the true audio story of how the king of rock and roll inspired the man who would become the greatest showman of his time. When Elvis Presley first walked into Sun Records in 1954, no one could have predicted the storm he was about to unleash. He was just a shy truck driver from Tupelo, Mississippi, clutching a guitar and chasing a dream. But the moment his voice hit the tape, it was clear. This wasn't just another singer. This was something new, something wild, something alive. Sam Phillips, the legendary producer, once said he was searching for a white boy who could sing like a black man. And in Elvis, he found not only the voice, but the charisma to ignite a cultural revolution. The rise was meteoric. His first single, "That's All Right," rippled across Memphis radio waves, fusing blues rhythms with country twang. The world had never heard such a sound. It was dangerous, intoxicating, irresistible. When Elvis appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in 1956, 60 million Americans tuned in. Mothers clutched their pearls, fathers frowned in disapproval. But teenagers, they screamed. They had found their idol. For the first time, youth had a soundtrack of rebellion, and it came wrapped in the slick smile and swiveling hips of Elvis Presley. But Elvis wasn't just making music, he was breaking barriers. At a time when America was divided by race and class, Elvis dared to blend black gospel, rhythm and blues, and white country into one explosive style. Critics accused him of being vulgar, of corrupting the youth. Church leaders called him the devil's servant, yet none of it mattered. The more they condemned him, the louder the crowds grew. To the young, Elvis wasn't corrupt. He was freedom. He gave them permission to feel, to move, to dream beyond the rigid walls society had built around them. And his reach extended far beyond America. Across the Atlantic, in post-war Britain, a generation was hungry for change. Elvis's records crossed the ocean, carrying with them not just music, but the very idea of rebellion. To British teenagers, Elvis was proof that life could be bigger than grey streets and ration books. And somewhere in a British boarding school, a boy named Farrokh Bulsara, lonely, different, searching for identity, listened closely. He would later recall how Elvis seemed larger than life, how his voice was both tender and powerful, commanding yet vulnerable. For that boy, Elvis was not just a singer, he was a possibility. Elvis's influence wasn't only in the sound, but in the spectacle. His performances were electric. He strutted across stages with confidence, commanding every eye, every heartbeat in the room. He looked into the camera as if he knew every girl watching was his, and every boy wanted to be him. He turned concerts into cultural moments. That kind of dominance, the ability to hold a crowd in the palm of your hand, was something Freddie Mercury would later study, imitate, and eventually master. By the 1960s, Elvis had become a global icon. His films filled theaters, his records topped charts, and his image was everywhere from jukeboxes to billboards. But beneath the glitz, what made Elvis truly revolutionary was his authenticity. He sang gospel with reverence, blues with grit, rock with fire. He poured every ounce of his soul into his voice, and that raw emotional truth was what cut across borders and reached the hearts of millions, including the young Freddie who quietly carried the spark. Elvis gave a generation its first taste of liberation. He showed them that music wasn't just entertainment, it was identity, rebellion, and hope. He was the sound of possibility, the embodiment of breaking free. For millions of young dreamers around the world, Elvis wasn't just the king of rock and roll. He was a guide, a symbol that life could be lived louder, wilder, freer. And as the shockwaves of his revolution spread, one boy in particular would take those lessons to heart, transforming them into something even greater. Elvis had opened the door. It was Freddie Mercury who would later walk through it, carrying the torch into a new era of rock. Farrokh Bulsara was born in 1946 on the island of Zanzibar, a place of heat, color, and contradiction. His family was Parsi, of Indian descent, and deeply tied to tradition. Yet the boy who would one day become Freddie Mercury never felt he belonged to just one world. From the start, he lived in between cultures, between expectations, between the safety of conformity and the pull of something daring and unknown. When his parents sent him to boarding school in India, young Farrokh found himself in a rigid environment defined by discipline and restraint. But it was also here that music first began to stir in him. He would sneak into practice rooms, sing with local choirs, and imitate the voices he admired. And then came Elvis. The first time Freddie heard Elvis Presley's records, it was like being struck by lightning. There was a rawness in Elvis's voice that cut through everything: authority, tradition, fear. Elvis didn't just sing, he commanded. He stood on stage with a swagger that said, "I dare you to look away." And for Freddie, a shy boy wrestling with identity, Elvis's confidence was intoxicating. He would later recall how he listened to those records over and over, mimicking Elvis's phrasing, trying to capture the same fire in his own voice. Imagine the scene. A teenage Freddie, alone in a dorm room, placing the needle on a vinyl record. The crackle of static fills the air. Then that unmistakable voice bursts through, rich, powerful, defiant. Freddie sings along, eyes closed, pretending he's on stage, pretending the cheers are for him. In those moments, Elvis wasn't just a distant star. He was a teacher, giving Freddie permission to dream bigger than his circumstances. But there was more than music at play. For a boy who often felt like an outsider, too foreign in England, too flamboyant for tradition, Elvis represented freedom. Elvis broke rules and didn't apologize for it. He blurred lines of race and class through music. He made the world feel bigger, more daring, and Freddie, quietly taking notes, absorbed every lesson. When his family later moved to England, Freddie struggled once again to find belonging. He was an immigrant boy in a grey post-war Britain where difference was often a target, but he carried Elvis's voice with him like a shield. He formed small bands, sang at pubs and colleges, and never stopped chasing the thrill he felt when Elvis sang. Friends remembered how Freddie would suddenly launch into Presley impressions, nailing the swagger, the vocal inflections, the smirk. It wasn't parody. It was reverence. Elvis was the blueprint Freddie was sketching his dream upon. By the late 1960s, Freddie was restless. He experimented with different groups, most notably Smile, a band with Brian May and Roger Taylor. He wasn't yet the Freddie Mercury the world would know, but already his ambitions set him apart. While others played music, Freddie studied it, studied how Elvis worked a crowd, how he turned a performance into theater. Elvis didn't just stand at a microphone. He moved, he seduced, he conquered. And Freddie, determined to leave his own mark, began to build a vision of performance that was bigger, bolder, and more unapologetic than anything Britain had ever seen. But here's the key. Freddie didn't want to be a copy of Elvis. He didn't want to be the next Presley. What Elvis gave him was not a mold but a spark, the courage to break molds entirely. Freddie once said, "I was never going to be a pop star. I was going to be a legend." And that conviction began with the realization, learned through Elvis, that music could make a man immortal. Elvis's voice carried Freddie through the loneliness of youth, through the challenges of displacement, through the hunger to belong. It became the compass that guided him from a shy boy named Farrokh Bulsara to a man bold enough to rename himself Freddie Mercury. And as he carved out his own path, one thing was certain: the king of rock and roll had already left his mark on the boy who would one day redefine what it meant to be a frontman. Elvis had shown Freddie the door. Freddie was preparing to step through it. By the early 1970s, Freddie Mercury was no longer just a dreamer imitating his idols. He was ready to step onto the stage of destiny. The formation of Queen in 1970 marked the beginning of his transformation. With Brian May, Roger Taylor, and later John Deacon, Freddie had found not just bandmates, but the canvas he needed to paint his grand vision of music and performance. But stepping into the spotlight was never simple. Freddie knew he carried the echoes of Elvis in his voice and in his spirit. The swagger, the confidence, the unspoken challenge to the audience: watch me and dare to look away. Yet Freddie also knew that to truly make his mark, he couldn't just be Elvis. He had to take that fire and transform it into something entirely his own. On stage, Freddie experimented. He borrowed Elvis's strut, but exaggerated it, adding flourishes that leaned into the theatrical. He pushed his voice beyond mimicry, weaving operatic highs with rock's gritty lows. Where Elvis was rebellion in leather, Freddie became rebellion in sequins, silk, and crown-like capes. And while Elvis had to walk carefully within the conservative boundaries of the 1950s, Freddie lived in an era that allowed him, though not without backlash, to challenge gender roles, sexuality, and the very definition of a rock star. The struggle was internal as much as external. Freddie was constantly balancing admiration with invention. He once confessed to friends that Elvis was a great teacher, but he couldn't remain in the shadow of the king forever. If Elvis taught him how to command a stage, Freddie wanted to teach the world how to live on it. Early Queen concerts reflected this tug of war. At first, Freddie's movements seemed cautious, studied, as if he were still testing the limits of how far he could go. But soon, he began to push boundaries, strutting in skin-tight outfits, wielding the microphone stand like a weapon, daring audiences to embrace his unapologetic flamboyance. And every time he crossed a line, the crowd roared louder. Still, the risk was immense. Britain in the 1970s was no more forgiving than America in the 1950s. Freddie's androgynous style, his boldness about love and desire, unsettled the mainstream. Tabloids mocked him. Critics sneered. But much like Elvis before him, Freddie leaned into the controversy. He knew that art without risk was meaningless. Elvis had danced on the line of scandal. Freddie shattered the line entirely. Behind the scenes, the pressure weighed heavily. Friends described Freddie as both supremely confident and deeply insecure. He would work tirelessly on his vocal delivery, agonizing over whether his performances lived up to his vision. He once said, "I always knew I was a star. And now, the rest of the world seems to agree with me." Yet even in this bravado, you can hear the echoes of someone who needed the validation of every cheer, every clap, every scream. What set Freddie apart was his refusal to remain contained by genre. He admired Elvis, yes, but he also admired opera greats, soul singers, and classical composers. In Queen, he fused these influences, creating a sound that could shift from hard rock to operatic spectacle within a single song. This was the evolution Elvis had inspired. Take the raw power of rebellion and expand it into a kaleidoscope of possibility. The tension reached its height in Queen's early years as they struggled for recognition. Audiences were unsure what to make of Freddie's blend of Elvis-inspired swagger and theatrical flamboyance. Was he mocking rock? Reinventing it? The answer, of course, was both. Freddie was daring to say that the boundaries themselves were meaningless, that music was performance, identity, and liberation all rolled into one. In these years, Elvis's influence burned like a torch in Freddie's hands. But instead of holding it steady, Freddie set it ablaze, letting the flames dance higher, hotter, brighter. He was no longer just the boy who listened to Elvis in secret dorm rooms. He was Freddie Mercury, an artist carving his name into the very foundation of rock and roll, ensuring that while Elvis had opened the door, Freddie would walk through it carrying his own crown. August 16, 1977. The world stopped. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, was gone. Fans gathered outside Graceland, weeping in disbelief. Radios played his songs on repeat, as if trying to fill the silence left behind. It wasn't just a death. It was the end of an era. Millions felt orphaned, as though a guiding star had suddenly fallen from the sky. Among those mourning was Freddie Mercury. To Freddie, Elvis wasn't just an icon. He was the very reason he had dared to dream. The swagger, the showmanship, the raw electricity. So much of what Freddie built had its roots in Elvis's fire. When the news broke, Freddie was devastated. He knew the world had lost more than a man. They had lost the heartbeat of rock. But Freddie wasn't the type to grieve quietly. For him, loss often transformed into art. Just 2 years after Elvis's death, in 1979, Freddie sat down and wrote a song unlike anything Queen had done before. He called it Crazy Little Thing Called Love. At first listen, it seemed playful, light, even cheeky. But beneath its rockabilly rhythm and Elvis-style vocal swagger, it was something far deeper. A love letter to the man who had inspired him. Freddie later explained that he wrote the song in just 10 minutes, strumming a guitar in a Munich hotel room. He admitted he wasn't much of a guitarist, but that limitation worked in his favor. The simplicity of the chords, the stripped-back rhythm, the almost throwback feel, it all harkened back to Elvis's early rock and roll style. Freddie wasn't trying to imitate. He was channeling. He was saying to the world, Elvis may be gone, but his spirit lives in me. When Queen recorded the track, it was drenched in Elvis's essence. The rhythm snapped with rockabilly energy. Freddie's vocals carried that unmistakable Presley swagger, deep, playful, commanding. On stage, Freddie leaned into the homage even further. He'd strut across the stage in leather jackets, swinging his mic stand with a grin, almost winking at the ghost of the king. Fans didn't need an explanation. They heard Elvis in every note. They felt him in every beat. The song became an instant hit. It topped the charts in the US, giving Queen their first American #1. But beyond its commercial success, what mattered was how it resonated with audiences. For many, it was as if Elvis's spirit had been resurrected, carried forward by one of his greatest disciples. Fans left Queen concerts, saying it felt like Elvis was alive again, breathing through Freddie's voice. There's a performance from 1980 that captures it perfectly. Freddie, dressed in leather, grips the mic with that same hypnotic confidence Elvis once had. The crowd sways, claps, screams, almost transported back in time. And when Freddie hits the final note, you can feel the echo of Graceland, the ghost of the king standing somewhere in the wings. Critics, too, recognized the homage. They called it Freddie's Elvis moment, a tribute that managed to honor the king without losing Mercury's own flamboyant touch. That was Freddie's genius. He never copied. He absorbed, transformed, and gave back something that was at once familiar and utterly his own. And for Freddie himself, Crazy Little Thing Called Love was more than just a song. It was closure. It was gratitude. It was his way of saying goodbye to the man who had taught him that music could be larger than life. In a sense, it was Freddie's final conversation with Elvis, delivered not in words, but in rhythm, melody, and fire. Looking back, it stands as one of the most powerful tributes in rock history, not because it was mournful, but because it was alive. Freddie didn't bury Elvis with sorrow, he resurrected him in joy, and in doing so, he ensured that the King's legacy didn't just end in Memphis. It roared on in stadiums filled with Queen's anthems, sung by a man who had once been just a boy in a dorm room, listening to Elvis on vinyl. By the mid-1980s, Queen was no longer just a successful band. They were a global force. Stadiums filled with hundreds of thousands, voices united in anthems that transcended language, culture, and time. And at the center of it all stood Freddie Mercury, commanding the stage with a presence so magnetic it felt almost supernatural. If Elvis had been the spark that ignited rock and roll, Freddie had become its blazing inferno. Consider Wembley Stadium, July 1986. Over 70,000 fans gathered for what would become Freddie's most iconic performance. As he strutted across the stage, microphone in hand, he controlled the crowd with effortless mastery. He didn't just sing, he summoned. A simple vocal call, I.O., was echoed back by tens of thousands, each voice a thread in the tapestry Freddie wove. In that moment, he embodied everything Elvis had once represented: rebellion, liberation, charisma. But he also embodied more. An evolution of what rock could mean. Where Elvis had shattered the cultural rules of the 1950s, Freddie shattered the artistic ones of the 1970s and 80s. Elvis had blurred lines between black and white music. Freddie blurred the lines of gender, sexuality, and identity. Dressed in leather one night, in a crown and regal cape the next, Freddie turned stages into kingdoms where he ruled without apology. His life itself became performance, daring the world to accept him, not in fragments, but in full. The torch of Elvis's legacy burned bright in Freddie's hands, but Freddie didn't carry it alone. He reshaped it. Elvis taught the world that music could be freedom. Freddie expanded that truth, proving it could also be transformation. He showed that rock wasn't confined to a sound. It was a language of defiance and authenticity, adaptable to every voice willing to speak it. And the ripple effect didn't stop with Queen. Just as Elvis had once inspired Freddie, Freddie's artistry lit the way for the next generations. George Michael openly idolized him, channeling Freddie's blend of vulnerability and power. Lady Gaga took her stage name from Queen's Radio Gaga and built a career on flamboyant reinvention, a page torn directly from Mercury's book. Even contemporary artists, Harry Styles, Adam Lambert, traced their courage back to Freddie's unapologetic brilliance. This was the echo of Elvis passed through Mercury, resonating into the future. Yet what made their parallel legacies so hauntingly similar was not just their triumphs, but their tragedies. Elvis died at 42, a man worn down by fame, addiction, and the crushing weight of expectation. Freddie would also leave the world too soon. At 45, his life cut short by AIDS at a time when the disease carried stigma as much as suffering. Both men had soared higher than most could ever dream, and both paid the price for carrying the weight of legend. But here's the truth. Neither truly died. Their music, their performances, their influence, these are immortal. Elvis once said, "Ambition is a dream with a V8 engine." Freddie embodied that engine, roaring louder, faster, wilder, until the world couldn't ignore him. And when Freddie stood on stage, the invisible thread connecting him to Elvis was undeniable. Every swivel of the hips, every smirk to the crowd, every note drenched in both power and vulnerability, it all carried the DNA of the king. Perhaps that's why Freddie's legacy feels so expansive. He wasn't just an artist standing on Elvis's shoulders. He was an artist building a bridge that carried the fire of one generation into the hands of another, ensuring the flame could never be extinguished. Elvis cracked the walls of conformity. Freddie tore them down. And so, when we speak of rock's golden age, we don't speak of Elvis or Freddie. We speak of Elvis through Freddie, and Freddie because of Elvis. Two men who never met, yet whose lives were inextricably bound by music, rebellion, and the hunger to live larger than life itself. Elvis Presley and Freddie Mercury. Two names that stand alone, yet echo endlessly through each other. They were separated by time, by geography, by the fact that their paths never crossed in life. And yet, when you trace the DNA of rock, you find one man's spark lighting another's fire. Elvis was the king, the original disruptor who dared to fuse gospel, blues, and country into something raw and unstoppable. He made music dangerous, made it thrilling, made it a weapon of liberation. And somewhere across oceans, his voice reached a boy named Farrokh Bulsara. That boy, an immigrant searching for identity, found courage in Elvis's swagger, freedom in Elvis's defiance, and possibility in Elvis's sound. Freddie Mercury took that influence and transformed it. Where Elvis broke cultural barriers, Freddie shattered artistic and personal ones. Elvis showed what it meant to be free on stage. Freddie showed what it meant to be free in life itself. Elvis gave us rebellion in leather. Freddie gave us liberation in sequins, opera, and unapologetic flamboyance. Together, their legacies form the bookends of rock's golden age, one opening the door, the other walking boldly through. And when Freddie sang Crazy Little Thing Called Love, he wasn't just writing a hit song. He was speaking directly to his idol. It was gratitude set to music, proof that influence never dies. It evolves, it adapts, it passes from one artist to the next. Elvis's flame did not extinguish in 1977. It burned brighter in the voice of Freddie Mercury, and it continues to burn today in the voices of those Freddie inspired. Both men left the world too soon. Both carried the heavy burden of being larger than life. But perhaps that's what makes their stories so enduring. They remind us that greatness often comes at a cost, but also that true art, art born of courage and authenticity, never fades. So, as you listen to Queen, as you watch Freddie command Wembley, as you hear the echoes of Elvis in every sway of the hips and every burst of swagger, ask yourself, where do you hear Elvis in Freddie's performances? Which tribute touched you the most? Because this isn't just a story about the past, it's about the echoes that shape us even now. Elvis lit the spark. Freddie turned it into a fire. And that fire still burns, roaring through time, immortal in sound, in memory, in legacy.